listening to the podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. It is the end of the year and I like to do a recap episode. So you have landed on the 2023 recap episode here. Super excited to talk to you about all the things that happened this year. So first, I have to start by talking about the fact that 2023 was a bit of a rocky year economically. Certainly, we started the year very hopeful, but there was a lot of uncertainty about where the economy was headed. I will say that it has not been as rocky a year as it certainly could have been. So I'm very thankful for that. For us at True Native Media, we are ending the year on a high note. We have had really good increases this year, which has been terrific, but not as big as between 21 and 22. I'm sure that that's the case industry-wide. And I will say that Q1, Q2 were a bit rockier. Q3 and Q4, we seem to recover quite a bit, and we are very hopeful that we're headed into a strong 2024. So it's been an interesting year. I think in the podcast industry, we have all been very accustomed to up and to the right, and that hasn't been the case all year, which is just a different experience for us. That being said, I feel like I heard lots of different things and read posts where people are like, this is the end of the podcast run and, we're not going to be increasing anymore. I don't think that that's the case at all. I still really believe that we're at the very beginning of where this industry is headed and that there is a lot of runway ahead of us, but it has been a rocky year. It hasn't been perfect, but I do believe that we've all gotten through it and 2024 should be good. So wanted to address that up front. Next, what I did was I went through all of my LinkedIn posts for the year. If you haven't seen me on LinkedIn, please go check me out over there. Really love to just get on LinkedIn. It's a perfect place to have conversations. So I went through all of the posts that I had put out there for 2023 to see which posts got the most traffic and interaction, what kind of hit a nerve with everyone. And so I wanted to cover that. So one of the posts, actually the post that got the very most interaction for me was the post that I made about the size of your audience. I think that there's really this nerve that gets hit in the podcast industry about the mega podcasters and the independent podcasters. I know this year there was a report that was put out that said if you advertise on like the top 50 or 100 podcasts, you're going to reach like 99% of the podcast listeners out there, or some really kind of high, absurd number. I don't personally believe that that's the case. I know if you've listened to some of the episodes I've done, in particular, I believe it was Acast, where we talked about the fact that that isn't at all their findings. And so I really do think that the independent podcaster, maybe the smaller podcaster, feels like when we talk about things like that, that we are very much discounting their audience. I also believe that we often look at a smaller audience and we think that it doesn't have as much value as a larger audience. One of the things that I have always said from day one that I do think is super important for people to realize, both podcasters as well as advertisers, you have to have an audience to get ad dollars. If you've got 100 listeners on your show, or if you're advertising on a show with 100 listeners, you're not going to get a lot of traction, right? There just isn't enough there to actually get traction. And the way I look at it is, in many cases, the advertiser would be more successful if they went to New York, stood on a busy street corner, and passed out $100 bills to get people to buy their products. That's kind of the way I think about it. So you do have to have an audience in order to really create any sort of traction when it comes to creating advertising success with advertisers. Now, what size audience is important? And that's, I think, the question that everybody asks. And that's why this post really got a lot of interaction and got some really great comments. And it's all about this idea that you need to have a dedicated audience that is sizable enough to move the needle for advertisers. The other thing that we always have to consider is that it can have a lot to do with how niche and specific your audience is. If you're creating a very general podcast, then you really do need a bigger audience. If you're speaking directly to one type of person that an advertiser is looking to reach, your audience doesn't need to be as big. The other thing that's important that I hope you understand listening to this show is that this is all about advertising. We're not talking about the quality of your show or the value of your show or the contribution of your show. We're talking about what kind of ad dollars can support a show and how large does that show need to be. Now, at True Native Media, we're looking for 50,000 downloads per month in order to work with a podcast and try and monetize that show. I do believe that if you have an audience of 1,000 to 5,000, that can really move the needle for a lot of advertisers, especially if you are looking at a very specific targeted audience. And so we know that small audiences can be extremely engaging, and we know that they are there for a very specific reason because they know, like, and trust that host. So I was very amused and happy that there was so much interest in talking about the power of small audiences. Now, my next most successful post or most engaged post really kind of goes hand in hand with the first, which is I posted about the fact that when I started True Native Media, I started it to really service the smaller shows. And my concept was, how can I aggregate these smaller shows together and sell them as a package? When I started in 2016, that didn't work. It didn't go over well. But I will say that for the first time in 8 years of me being in the industry, in 2023, we have had more run of network campaigns than we have ever before. We've had more interest in run of network campaigns. So I really do think that the scale is tipping. Now, one of the important things to consider, though, about these run of network campaigns is that the more targeting you do, the more expensive that campaign is going to be. If somebody comes in and says, hey, I want, 11 million impressions this month. Great, we can do that. No problem. Like, here's your 11 million impressions. But if you say, I want to reach women between the ages of 18 and 25, and I want them in New York, I want them in LA, I want them to have an income of over 100,000. Every time you put a specification on a campaign, the cost is going to go up. And one of the values of run of network campaigns is that they can be priced cheaper. But when you put in all the specificity, then they become more expensive. So that's just an important piece to look at. But it is nice to see that for smaller shows, there can be the opportunity of being part of that aggregated group and being monetized. And of course, we're seeing this happen a lot through programmatic advertising. And please make sure that you stay tuned to upcoming episodes, because I just interviewed Casey from the Trade Desk. We talk all about programmatic advertising. It was a great interview. That's going to come out at the beginning of January, so make sure to check that out. But there's a lot of opportunity that is to be had with really aggregating those smaller shows, and excited to see where all of that goes. Next, the LinkedIn post that got the most interactions was one about impression-based selling. Now, I have a theory. I'm going to try this next year where we are going to move to impression-based selling. Essentially, I talked about this in my last episode with Lex Friedman, but essentially, when we're working with direct advertisers who have never been in the podcast space before, why do I need to explain to them what embedded ads are and what dynamically inserted ads are? It's all just very confusing, and it gets extremely technical. And essentially, we are just selling impressions. Now, of course, an impression is not always an impression. Every impression is not created equal, and that's a whole nother topic and could be a whole nother episode. But for direct advertisers, we're really going to lean into how do we simplify podcast ad selling, and how do we make it something that smaller brands or newer brands to the space don't have to get a full educational course on how to do this? How can we make it something that is an easy process for them? And really, for me, that is all impression-based selling. So let's create a campaign where we say, hey, we believe in this campaign that you're going to get between 100 and 120,000 impressions in this time period. This is how much we're going to charge you on a CPM basis. When we get to the end of the campaign, we're going to charge you for those impressions, just like many other mediums do out there. And then it's very easy, it's very cut and dry. And so that post on LinkedIn got a lot of traction because I really do think that there is opportunity for us to move into more of that impression based selling. All right, that is my LinkedIn wrap up for the year. Now let's talk a little bit about the industry as a whole and some of the things that I have seen in the industry. The first is that we had a big iOS change in September, and it really did have an impact on podcasts and their download numbers. And what I found is that the podcasts that were older and had been around for more years had a much greater impact. So our shows that were very long standing definitely got dinged. Some of our more current shows where all of them are current, but some of the shows where maybe they just started in the last year, maybe the last 2 years, they really didn't have nearly the impact that some of our older shows had. But I will say that that has been a topic that I have talked to many, many of our podcasters about. And it's so hard when, these podcasters have been working so many years to try and create these really great shows and create this great content, and they feel like they've reached a certain level in terms of audience size, and then a technology update changes that picture and they feel like they're out of control, right? Like they've been working so hard to get to a certain number, and now it's as though someone has come in and cut their number and it was totally out of their control. So that definitely has been a challenge for our podcasters. But we always know that any sort of truing up or really any sort of correction that needs to take place to make sure our numbers are accurate is ultimately the best for the industry, and it's the best for the advertiser. No one wants to be charging for fake numbers or people who don't really exist. And so it is really important that these sorts of changes happened, but I know that it really was a bit of an upset. So had to bring that up. Next, a big change that we have seen this year is the number of frequency capped campaigns that are being ordered. If you haven't listened to my episode about frequency capping, I encourage you to go and check that out. We really kind of dive deep into what frequency capping is and what it means for the industry. I really believe that it is a very, very important issue facing us that we really need to be addressing. And really, this frequency capping is the industry's attempt to create the best results possible for direct response advertisers, those companies that are looking to see a direct response from their ad dollars turning into conversions. And I understand the frequency capping. I even encourage the idea of frequency capping. My concern is the technology is really not there to support the frequency capping that needs to take place. I will say in a LinkedIn post that I did the other day, I did get some comments about the fact that there are certain hosting platforms out there that maybe are making some advancements. That's great to hear. I still am really an advocate for how do we take some of this ad tech out of the hosting companies kind of realm and place it into really the ad space where I think it belongs. But yeah, frequency capping, definitely a really important topic and something that I really do believe is going to impact the industry this next year. The other thing that I saw was a lowering of CPMs this year. So as I do think we have moved more into the dynamic insertion realm, and as we are maybe not seeing the same types of conversions that are happening on dynamically inserted campaigns as with embedded, because of course with embedded campaigns, we saw a really big return because super long tail on that. And also the advertisers not actually paying for all of the impressions that they're getting. And so of course, when you're not paying for all of the impressions you're getting, it makes the price cheaper. And so that factors into the economics of all of it. But really, we did see a drop in CPMs this year. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I also do think the economy really factored into a decrease in CPMs. CPMs, ultimately, we do need to look at the fill rate. And I would be so interested to know if there is anybody in the industry who could tell us what the true fill rate is of the impressions that are out there. So, number one, no one really has any idea, I don't think, how many actual impressions there would be to deliver. But if we were able to look at the deliverable impressions and then how many of those are actually being filled, I think that that would give us a really good sense of where we're at in terms of capacity for the industry. But, ultimately, the way I look at it is if we need to edge down our CPMs for a higher fill rate, that's going to benefit everyone because, the minute that we have an ad that goes unfilled, we can't go back and sell that ad. It's just lost opportunity. So really, I do believe going into 2024, we're going to continue to see kind of, some adjustments to rates to get to a place where we really see a lot of success with dynamic ad insertion and also with fill rates. So we definitely saw that. Now, I saved kind of two of the bigger happenings for the end because I figure everyone always starts with these things. So why not end with them? And that is YouTube. Like, of course, YouTube has had a huge impact on the industry this year. I personally believe that it is probably one of the most important factors in the industry right now. Sounds Profitable recently did a terrific study about the differences between listening to podcasts and watching podcasts on YouTube primarily, and the interaction between the two. The people who are actually listening to podcasts also tend to be those that are watching them, and it's the same person. The whole study was really fascinating. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, I would encourage you to head on over to Sounds Profitable and download that study. And I think you probably watched the webinar that Tom Webster gave as well. Very informative. But YouTube is a huge, huge deal in the podcast space. And really what I'm seeing more than anything is as we continue to monetize podcasts, we're moving into more of the creator space. So moving away a bit from this idea that I am a podcaster and that is what I do, into this idea that I am a content creator. I have a podcast. I also have that podcast on YouTube. You can watch me on YouTube. You can listen to me on YouTube. You can consume the content on social media. All of these are really opportunities to engage with people. And I think the most important thing for us to look at, I know that there are a percentage of people who only listen to podcasts, but then I also say, is that really true? Like, how many of us out there only listen to podcasts? Like, I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I also go on YouTube. I also go on social media. I also watch TV, right? There are opportunities to reach people in different venues. And as a content creator, if you're able to reach out and speak to your audience on these different platforms, there's a lot of power in that. Now, going back to podcasting and YouTube and kind of how really we're looking at the industry and how it's going to impact the industry is that YouTube started ingesting RSS feeds, which is good because that's really going to expand the listenership of podcasts. As far as I can tell, they are still not ingesting all RSS feeds. I believe that if you want your RSS feed ingested into YouTube, you simply have to reach out to YouTube. I think it's an easier process to get your show set up on YouTube than maybe it was 6 months ago. We are going to get to a place where YouTube does ingest a lot of podcast RSS feeds, or maybe all of them, right? Like other podcatcher apps out there that, were created and just picked up all the RSS feeds and reposted them. So I do believe we're going to get to a place with YouTube where this happens. Now, the reason that this is so significant and so important is because YouTube is not doing any pass-through of ad revenue, meaning that if you're a podcaster, let's just do a quick scenario. You're a podcaster, you have your podcast on Megaphone, you're doing dynamic ad insertion, you've got a nice lineup of ads, you've got a nice audience, right? So now in Megaphone, I can see that I've got a certain audience size and I've got certain dollar, amounts that are coming in for my advertising. If I listen to your podcast on Apple, if I listen to your podcast on Spotify, if I listen to your podcast on Overcast, or really any of the podcast apps that are out there, I'm going to get served ads that were dynamically inserted into your podcast through Megaphone. And then I get to monetize those, right? Well, YouTube now will be ingesting the podcast. And so you'll be able to hear the podcast, but you're not going to be able to hear any of the ads. And also, your listener numbers from YouTube are not going to be reflected in your hosting platform. So it's really like a whole other beast out there, right? And the issue is that as an industry, we've been on this path of how are we monetizing shows in a certain way using dynamic ad insertion. And now if we have a huge shift, which we already know YouTube is one of the largest listening platforms out there, if we have this huge shift and we are not able to serve our ads through YouTube that we've been serving through these other platforms, where does that leave the advertising industry? I think it's a huge issue. Perhaps issue is not the right word. I think it's a huge topic that needs to be watched and really considered as the industry moves forward. And as we're great at doing in the podcast industry, it simply really is just going to require a pivot in the way that we are doing things. I will say at True Native Media, we have podcasts that are podcasts as well as YouTube channels. They're performing really well. They're monetizing really well. I'm excited about this opportunity for the partnership. However, the video element is really important. And that's where I do think a lot of podcasters need to lean in. And I also think a lot of advertisers need to lean in because there's opportunity with that podcast YouTube combination that's extremely powerful. YouTube was a big issue, a big topic in 2023. It will continue to be a big topic in 2024. I think it's one of the pivotal conversations the industry needs to be having. And last, but of course not least, is AI. How could I do a wrap up of 2023 without talking about AI? It is all over everything. My favorite AI topic this year that I was privy to listening to via a wonderful podcast was from Sam Harris. He said, if someone told you there were aliens that were going to be taking over the planet in 10 years and you didn't prepare for it, that would be a little silly. Of course, I'm tweaking his quote just a tad. AI is having an impact on our industry, our lives, our businesses, and it will continue to have a huge impact on our lives and our businesses. This AI is essentially this alien headed toward our planet, and it is very important that we pay attention to it. What that actually means beyond ChatGPT, not totally sure. But AI really is playing a big role in where we are headed. And of course, in the podcast space, I would say the most common use case is with AI generated voices. And there are lots of conversations about the value of AI generated conversations, AI generated ads, and things of that nature. So certainly not something I'm going to cover in this podcast, but it can't go without being said that AI is an important factor in the industry. I am sure that there are tons of advancements in AI that I'm totally unaware of that I'm sure will bubble to the surface, but something for us all to be paying close attention to. Well, that's 2023 from my perspective. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have enjoyed putting it together for you. It's always great to have reflection. I know I'm a huge goals person. I have my goals lined out for 2024, but I'm going to be taking the next few weeks to really tweak and perfect those. So looking forward to having a great 2024. I hope that you are as well. Please make sure you do go check out my YouTube channel if you haven't been, to see all the great things we're doing over there. I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you again in the new year. Thank you for listening to the Podcast to Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast to advertising industry.